I am Alex Tabany, Director of Computer Technologies Program. In this video, we'll be discussing how to request a workplace accommodation, when to make the request, how to prepare your request, and what to expect in the process. Disclaimer: this presentation was not prepared or reviewed by a lawyer specializing in accommodations. It's not legal advice and it's for informational purposes only. Every person's situation is unique. This presentation relates to accommodations in the workplace, which has differences from accommodations in an educational environment. If you need legal assistance, consider contacting a lawyer or the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, JEDF, for guidance. Here's a quick summary in case you don't watch the whole video. I really recommend you watch the whole video because this is a very important topic. First thing is to make your request in writing. This is extremely important to do. You should recommend your needed or preferred accommodations in your request, and you should offer to engage in a process with your employer to find a solution. And finally, be prepared that you may be asked for medical documentation, and this is to verify your need for this accommodation. All employers will request this, but they, under law, are able to. And so to review the law itself, an accommodation is assistance or changes to a position or workplace that will enable an employee to do their job or participate in the hiring process. The ADA requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified employees with disabilities, unless doing so would pose an undue hardship. So the first thing to consider is when you should be making your request. In almost all cases, you should make your request for an accommodation after you are hired. This is to avoid potential discrimination before you're hired. Two potential exceptions to this rule, though. The first is if you require accommodations to be able to participate in the hiring process or interview. And the second is if your disability is visually apparent and you think it's likely the employee may question your ability to do the job or how much assistance you may need to do the job. That could be another reason you'd want to discuss your accommodation needs earlier in the hiring process. So let's go into that first point. If you require accommodation to be able to participate in the hiring process, you should make that request in advance when the accommodation is needed. Submit your request when an interview or other event in the hiring process is proposed or scheduled. Do not submit your accommodation request with your job application or inquiry. If the employer has a method in place for requesting accommodations, use that. Otherwise, submit your request in writing. And that could be through a physical letter or email or both. Some examples of accommodations that may be needed during the hiring process: a sign language interpreter, physical accessible location, a reader for the blind, or additional time for test taking. Of course, if you require a sign language interpreter to communicate, then having one available is the employer's responsibility so that you can participate in the interview or hiring process. If you have mobility limitation, if you are in a wheelchair or some other issue of this nature, being able to actually physically access the location of which the interview is being held is something that you can ask for. For example, if the interview is going to be taking place in a building on the second floor and there's no elevator, you may request that they move the meeting to the ground floor so that it is physically accessible to you. A reader for the blind and additional time for test taking, which is similar to an accommodation being requested in an educational environment. And this is so that you have an equal chance of proving your qualifications in the hiring process. So that second exception to requesting accommodations earlier in the hiring process is if your disability is apparent And you may want to discuss this with the hiring manager during the interview. You may want to discuss how you will do your work and what tools you'll use. And you might want to mention your ability to manage your personal needs just as any other employee would. And in this case, I've used a photo of a person carrying a white cane. And we all know this means a person who is blind or visually impaired. Most people, when they see a person with a white cane, will see a white cane and not necessarily a person. And so if you're going to an interview and you are a person with a visually apparent disability, the employer, the hiring manager, may spend the interview wondering how it is that you'll be able to do the job, but may not feel comfortable or think they're able to ask you how you will be able to do the job. So you might want to take that opportunity to briefly explain that to them, how your accommodation works. If you are blind, that you use a screen reader and that you can use a computer just like anybody else with your accessibility. If you have other practical needs that you can manage yourself in your personal care, and you will not need your employer's assistance while you're on the job. And these can be very personal decisions, so it is your decision. If you do mention these, it's best to focus on what your strengths are and your ability to do the job. That's really what the employer should be concerned with is, are you able to do the job? And if you have an opportunity to explain that, that can be a benefit to you. And ultimately, you want to get the discussion about disability out of the way so you can move on to talking about your real qualifications for the position you're applying for. So how to prepare your request. So it should include these three elements in our opinion. For the individuals we worked with, we always encourage them to use these. We have a template accommodations request that we will make available in a link in the description at a later date. And you're welcome to use that if you find it helpful. First thing that's important is to mention that this is an ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, accommodation request. You're requesting an accommodation due to disability. And this is important because not all accommodations are disability related. In fact, the majority of workplace accommodations do not have to do with disability, but just ordinary life situations. So it's important that you mention that this is an ADA accommodation request because you are invoking the use of the law that protects you in the workplace. Second is, you should state what the recommended or requested accommodation for yourself is. And ideally, you'll know what accommodation that you need. To be able to do the job, you probably already know what it is that you'll need to be successful, and that's what you should be asking for. However, if you don't know, that's okay. If you know you need something, but you're not quite sure how it's going to work, you should just request to discuss it with your employer to find a solution. And that's quite similar to the third point, which is to let your employer know you're open to discuss or work together to meet your accommodations needs. An employer fulfilling an accommodations request should be an interactive process. You should be engaging with your employer to find an appropriate solution. It isn't a demand that you're making that the employer must fulfill exactly as you state it. It should be a starting point for a conversation with the employer about how to accommodate you so that you're able to do your job and do your job well. So here's a sample letter. Dear Ms. Smith, I'm excited to be working for Acme Industries. As a person with a disability, I'd like to request a reasonable accommodation as defined under the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. I'd like to request an hour off every Friday in order to attend a regularly scheduled doctor's appointments. To make up for my missed time, I'd like to shorten my regular hour lunch break to 30 minutes on Tuesday and Thursday. Please let me know if you need any medical documents of my disability and need for this accommodation. I'd be happy to meet with you to discuss options for accommodating my disability. So in this letter, we're stating that we are making a request. using the ADA. We're stating what accommodation we would prefer, and that we're leaving the door open to discussion about this accommodation. You should know employers aren't required to give you exactly what you're asking for, but they need to give you an accommodation that will work. So in this case, you're asking for your lunches being shortened on 2 days to make up for this missed time. Well, that may or may not work for this particular employer. They may want you to do something else to accommodate this missed time, and that would be perfectly appropriate for the employer to discuss with you and come to an agreement on. Schedule modifications are one of the most common type of accommodation, and it's often one of the simplest to fulfill for an employer. Lots of people need to modify their schedules for things that don't relate to disability. So this is a relatively normal issue to deal with in a workplace. So what to expect? You submitted your request. And at that point, ideally, what you would love to have is simply a notice that you've been granted the accommodation that you requested. Maybe the practical details about how you receive this equipment or what you need to do. They may ask to have a meeting with you to discuss your request. It doesn't mean they're saying no. It just means that they want to talk it out to make sure that you're happy, they're happy, it's working for everybody involved. Or they may have alternative suggestions, which is also okay, as long as their alternative suggestions still accommodate you appropriately. And then finally, they can request medical documentation sufficient to verify the reason an accommodation is needed. So this is not your entire medical history. And so if they do make this request, work with your doctor to get a statement or get a subsection of your medical file that only relates to demonstrating why you need this accommodation in the workplace. In our experience, few employers will ask for medical documentation because generally employers don't want to deal with that kind of information at all. Of course they can, and some most certainly will, but in our experience, it's not that common. So here's just a recap. First, make your request in writing. Ultimately, this is a legal request, and so a verbal request is really not sufficient. People don't always hear things right, understand things right. They may not remember. If you don't have a physical record of it, then ultimately you can't prove that you made this request. If it gets misunderstood and you don't get what it is that you need, that's where things can go wrong as well. So make the request in writing. It's very important. Recommend or suggest a solution. You should be an expert in your own disability. You should have a general idea, at least, of what it is that you will need to be successful in this role. You should give it some thought when you're applying for the job. What would I need to be successful if they wanted to hire me? If you don't know, though, that's okay. Ultimately, you want to engage in a process with your employer to find an appropriate solution. Every individual is unique and every workplace is unique. And so there's not going to be a cookie cutter solution to all of these accommodation needs. And of course, be prepared that you may be asked for medical documentation. Just make sure that you're only providing what's necessary for this request, not your entire medical history. And if you did just have general questions about accommodations, workplace accommodations, and what makes for a reasonable accommodation, things of that nature, you really should check out our other presentation linked in the description below. And finally, the ADA is a powerful tool that empowers you. That's its ultimate goal, is to allow you to compete on an equal playing field with others so that you're able to do your job and do your job well, to excel, to not be discriminated against. So best of luck in your career goal. And here at Computer Technologies Program, we provide services for individuals referred by the California Department of Rehabilitation. Contact us if you're interested in our services or referring. And you can contact us through email, admissions@ctpberk.org or 510-849-2911.